So Professor Lorna Woods will also be joining us this afternoon, but she is going to join in solely by audio. So with everybody with us, it's now time for me to say hello and welcome. And thanks so much, everyone, for taking the time to join us this afternoon for our final seminar this academic term. My name is Nora Lidjan, and I'm Director of the Information Law and Policy Centre at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, one of the academic centres based at the University of London. I expect that some of you already received updates about our events and the activities of the centre, but if not, please sign up to our monthly newsletter or follow us on Twitter. Now, it is my very great pleasure to chair and introduce our really excellent panel of speakers today for a very timely and topical seminar focusing on the impact of design choices in social media on autonomy and consequently speech, and to the extent to which controls on design techniques constitute an interference with users' human rights. This will include discussion of predominant design choices for online advertising, such as the surveillance capitalism business model as coined by Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff, and the resulting attention economy that results, as described by former Google employee James Williams, with social media competing for our attention of every hour of every day. Our speakers will explore the impact of such design choices on autonomy and an individual's capacity to form and hold an opinion. Opinions which include everything from what advent calendar you may have bought this year to who or what you may have voted or decided not to vote for in an election or a certain referendum. Our first panelist this afternoon is Dr. Konstantinos Kalaris. Konstantinos joined Essex Law School as lecturer in law in 2019. Previously, he was a postdoctoral research fellow at King's College London and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Frankfurt. He holds a DPhil in jurisprudence from the University of Oxford and a PhD in criminal law and criminology from the University of Athens. Konstantinos has taught jurisprudence and legal theory at the University of Oxford and King's College London. His research interests are in the area of legal and political theory, criminology, and behavioral analysis of law. He has published on paternalism, the concept and value of autonomy, organized crime and corruption. He is also a member of the Athens Bar Association and has served as a member and chair of the Greek Political Asylum Tribunal. Konstantinos is currently working on a research project funded by the British Academy, which explores the effects of cuts to legal aid in England and Wales. Our second panelist this afternoon is Susie Allegra. Susie is a barrister and associate tenant at the renowned Doughty Street Chambers, a senior research fellow at the University of Roehampton, and associate of the policy practice. An international human rights lawyer with over 20 years' experience, she has worked on some of the most challenging legal and political issues of our time, including combating corruption in the developing world, human rights and security, protecting human rights at borders, the human rights impacts of climate change, and the impact of Brexit on individual rights and security. She also has particular expertise in human rights and technology. And last but not at all least is our discussant today, Professor Lorna Woods. Lorna is Professor of Internet Law at the University of Essex. She started her career as a practicing solicitor in technology, media, and telecommunications practice in the City of London. She has wide experience in the field of media policy and communications regulation, including data protection, social media, and the internet, and her publications record reflects this breadth. Her current research project with Carnegie UK Trust is on reducing harm arising from social media, and she was awarded an OBE in recognition of her work. Lorna also has a long-standing interest in privacy and the law relating to surveillance. She is serving a second term as a member of the ESRC Peer Review College. She is a Senior Associate Research Fellow, I'm delighted to say, here at the ILPC, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. She is a member of a group of advisors who support the Surveillance Camera Commissioner in his role, established under Surveillance Camera Code of Practice, and has sat on the Automated Number Plate Recognition National User Group, advising the Surveillance Camera Commissioner and the Police Force since 2015. She's also a member of the Impress Code Committee. So now, in terms of the format for this seminar, our panelists will both present their presentations, and Lorna will then briefly respond with her insights and analysis on these presentations. We will then open up the discussion to the digital floor, or more accurately, the Zoom chat box beneath in Q&A. So now I would like to thank our speakers and for you for joining us here this afternoon, and will now invite Konstantinos to begin this seminar on dark design in social media, autonomy, and the freedom of expression. Konstantinos, whenever you're ready, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled, I must say. And may I also thank my esteemed colleague, Lorna Wood, for suggesting that she do this. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to discuss some issues that are currently, I think, discussed in ways that perhaps are not 100% satisfactory for some people. So I will try to bring together some normative discussions to begin with. Autonomy, freedom of expression, nudging, choice architecture, and then try to provide the first link to choice architecture on social media. And in that sense, I will try to set the stage for the discussion that will follow, as my colleagues are more qualified than me to discuss specific interventions. So if I just, yeah, this should be better. If we can start with nudging, with apologies to those who are already familiar with the concept. Let me just remind you of some basic concepts. So nudging is based on two premises, basically. The first premise is that people are not perfectly rational. And the second premise is that we know how they fail to be rational. So these mistakes are normally called biases. So a bias is a departure, if you will, from perfect rationality. It's how we fail to be perfectly rational. So the point here is, why shouldn't we use behavioral economics to correct these mistakes by means of nudging? Nudges are non-coercive interventions. So instead of giving people fines, for example, or threatening them with sanctions, why should we just use what we know about biases in order to correct their mistakes? Now, there's no such thing as a neutral definition, I suppose, and this is, again, proof of this. Because I know that most of you are now thinking, well, what do you mean by correct? And there is a benevolent approach to this question that says that nudges basically debias people. So they remove our biases and they restore rationality. Then there is the more suspicious approach that says that, well, what nudges basically do is that they exploit our biases in order to direct us towards good decisions. And I will give you an example. Apparently, I have a tenant's insurance. As a less than perfectly rational human being, I only purchased one after I broke something in the flat. So at some point, I got an email a few weeks ago that said that I don't have to do anything about my tenant's insurance. And then there was fine print that said that if you don't want your insurance to be renewed, you can go to this website and opt out. Now, you could say that I was in the Roach Motel, as they call it. This is a bit of a dark design here, because they made it really difficult for me to opt out, given that people tend to succumb to inertia. I will come back to this in a minute. But then they did the exact opposite. They gave me a cooling off period of 14 days. So this is an example of how nudging can be both benevolent in that sense, it can debias people, and how we can exploit our biases to lead us towards specific decisions. And when nudges do that with our well-being in mind, then this is libertarian paternalism. So I'm just using libertarian paternalism here to explain what I think nudges can do for us. Nudges do not have to be paternalistic, of course, but it's a good example of the problems that might emerge. Now, the difference between libertarian paternalism and traditional paternalism is that libertarian paternalism is not coercive. It is based on nudges. So Thalen is something promised that they will give us, they will promote or protect our well-being without restricting our freedom. That would solve the puzzle that is paternalism. Again, the problem here is that perhaps we're not all on the same page when it comes to the concepts. When they say freedom, they mean a lack of coercion. So if you're not coerced, you're free. Following Berlin's seminal essay on the two concepts of liberty, we're all familiar with the idea that there's such thing as positive liberty as well. So this, an absence of coercion or manipulation can be seen as negative freedom, freedom from undue interference. But a lack of options, for example, can be seen as a lack of positive freedom or restriction of positive freedom. That's why we say, following Hobhouse, that there is real freedom and there is nominal freedom. So the homeless guy around the corner may have all the nominal freedom in the world, but he doesn't have any real freedom because he doesn't have any options, doesn't have any positive freedom. And there are people who bring the two together to create more comprehensive accounts of autonomy. And the richer account, I think, and by far the most influential perhaps, is Joseph Raz's self-authorship. Raz explains that in order to be autonomous and author our own lives, we need both. We need both freedom from coercion and manipulation and options, an adequate range of options. But then there is also well-being. Now, I understand that those of you who do not subscribe to this rather thin idea of negative freedom might already think that nudging could be problematic. But when it comes to well-being, things can get even worse, because what they say, Taylor and something, in their book, which was published in 2008, is that by well-being they mean what the person wants anyway. But in 2003, when they first presented the idea, they had a more objective account of well-being in mind. Today, I think that most theorists who try to decipher nudging take it as granted that this 2008 statement is more of wishful thinking. We hope that we can know what the person wants anyway, but we can't. In interpersonal relationships, maybe that is possible. But when the nudger is the policymaker, the government, for example, or a big corporation, they can't know. So we basically fall back to a more objective idea of well-being. And in this case, it is, of course, the homo economicus, the person who is relatively rational. So this is how nudges work. And the method is, this is what nudges want to achieve rather. The method is what we call choice architecture. And the example that we've all heard of, I suppose, is that of the cafeteria manager who wants us to eat healthily. And what she does is that she places healthy foods at eye level and unhealthy foods on the top shelf or the bottom shelf, because people tend to pick what they see. Now, of course, obviously this didn't work for me because I'm 6'4" and I kept getting the burgers, but for most people it does. So immediately, if you only look at choice architecture, even this very simple example, it is obvious that there's something wrong in terms of autonomy. Because if all we need is a non-coercive interference, we have it. The option is still there. You can still get the burger or the pizza or the dessert. But it seems, it reminds us of what our parents used to do, for example, when we couldn't stop eating candy. They would hide the candy jar away on the top shelf. And then we'll just forget because we're children. So it's similar here. Because we're fallible like that, we're not perfectly rational, we'll just get what we see. And that way, we will make the good decision. But there's nothing about us in this decision. Ourself is not in this decision. If it isn't manipulation, as some people claim, there is a certain usurpation of decision-making involved here. It's not me. I never made that decision. I somehow ended up doing what's good for me, but I never made a decision. And some of you might think, well, maybe it's not as effective as that. So we're kind of safe. Choice architecture can be very effective. Defaults are a very good example. If you take a look at Austria and Germany and their organ donation schemes, when organ donation was the default option in Austria, almost every single Austrian was an organ donor. Nobody opted out. They could, but almost no one did. In Germany, where the opposite was true, so organ donation, so no donation was the default, only 12% of Germans opted in and became organ donors. Now, the vast cultural differences between the two countries notwithstanding, I'll go out on a limb here and say that it is the power of the default that caused this effect. And again, some may think that, well, but there is an effort tax attached to this. Because just like you never went to that website to review your insurance, people never went to the office. It takes time, effort. So maybe we should just minimize that. Make sure that it doesn't take a lot of time, it doesn't take a lot of effort. But then how much effort does it take to pick up the remote and change the channel? Almost not at all. And yet, people don't do that. That's why we have lead-in tactics on television. If you want to boost the popularity of a program, you broadcast it right after a very popular program, because people tend to not change the channel. So inertia works. And now finally, I'm coming to free speech and autonomy. I've been talking about autonomy, but let's link it to free speech now. It seems to me that especially for those who really think that self-authorship is the kind of autonomy that we should be interested in, this a rich, comprehensive account of autonomy that it is also an exercise concept, and it involves having an active character, as Stephen Walt once put it. We also think that free speech is an integral part of this self-authorship. Because yes, we all think, I suppose, that free speech has instrumental value, and is an essential tool in deliberative democracy. There's no point in voting if we can't discuss. And, you know, in the old Millian ideal, with experiments of living and so forth, we challenge the old, bring in the new, and so forth. That's how progress happens. But it also has intrinsic value, I think. So I express myself, and that is part of my self-authorship. It doesn't matter whether someone else has said it before, better than me. Consider politics, for example. Am I going to be an autonomous member of this political community if I never say anything? If I will say, well, it is what the other guy said, really, I have nothing to add. But even that is an expression. I agree with that person. But also, what one might call the passive right to free speech. Receiving and assessing information is equally important. And it has been highlighted by the Strasbourg Court. If you can't receive and assess information, then again, as Nagel once said, you can't be trusted as an autonomous and equal member of this political and moral community. And this brings me to this. You have to forgive me because I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Instagram, I'm only on Twitter, so that's all I know. But this is choice architecture in action on Twitter. Especially with Donald Trump. You used to get this quite a lot after the election. The tweet violated the Twitter rules about, in that case, it was fake news or election rules, but it is in the public's interests for the tweet to remain accessible. But in other cases, you get this, about a tweet or a profile. You wouldn't be able to see it. Now, I think that immediately this reminds us of the cafeteria example, or what my insurance company did. So you get in bold letters that this is a problem. You have a problem here. You shouldn't see this, perhaps. And then you have this little box where you can just click, and that means that the option remains available. You can still view the tweet or the profile. Now, of course, imagine this in a long thread where you have already read a lot and you think, well, I don't really have to. I mean, that's fine. I'll skip it. So that's how you can hide people's opinions from the world. And then, of course, there is the right of this person who tweeted that to free expression, but there's also my right to receive that information. And if this actually works, and many people don't bother and they never get to view that tweet, that is a problem. May I remind you, of course, it's not the most, it's not the nicest example one can come up with in politics, but it is exactly what Donald Trump used to say for quite a long time, and I think he still does, that you don't let the people listen to me. So there are several things that happen here, and I'm going to finish with this. the first thing that happens is, of course, this kind of choice architecture that says, well, the option is still available, but makes it difficult for you to actually access that option. The second thing that happens is that people have authority bias. So sometimes when you see that Twitter has decided that this is bad for you, you would just accept that and say, well, maybe this is really sensitive. I don't want to see that. Maybe that's offensive. I'd rather skip that. But the most important thing that happens, I think, and that I'm hoping we can discuss today, is that this creates boxes. And these boxes are quasi-default. So this is in the, bad content box. And this creates a quasi-default when people think, even if I do view this tweet, this is the kind of thing that should be cautious about. There's something wrong about this. So immediately your default you start from the default point that this is bad. And that definitely affects, I think, public discourse. And it does affect the way that we perceive the information we receive, but it also affects the way that we speak online, because we need to censor ourselves sometimes to make sure that we don't get this and we don't end up in the bad box. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I hope this will set the stage for the debate to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Konstantinos. I think, you've set up, some of the very eminent scholarship in this area that deals with the theoretical underpinnings of nudging. Cass Sunstein Taylor's work, has set the discourse. And as you mentioned, it also in turn then began the beginning of some very critical responses in the scholarship regarding the limitations, but also the inherent harms to autonomy and the other values that we have to protect in a democratic society. And I think, as you said, you're absolutely right. Once you introduce choice into any design context, including architecture and online, and I really like the example you gave of the cafeteria, because it gives, a very clear illustration of how both the act itself, the decision to do so, and its effects are inherently manipulative. They are completely contrary and adverse to the value of autonomy. But of course, as you mentioned, autonomy, it's one of the key values in a democratic society. And there has been case law on this from the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg about the fact that we don't just have a right to freedom of speech and to express ourselves, but also then the freedom to receive diverse and pluralistic information, which then informs our views and our choices and our decisions about health, all those normative aims that feed back into how these nudging policies then get justified, that it's for protection of your health that you have that apple and not that burger, Konstantinos, or it's the protection of society that we need to make sure that this tweet is removed, or that actually it's in the public interest. But then again, in terms of this, nudging architecture, we then come into very significant legal questions about when are they justified? What are the legal and policy frameworks in place that set out the clear and very precise rules and the limits on governments and other corporate entities as to how far these may be applied? To what people, in what circumstances, what is the independent oversight if redress is then sought? And then ultimately, I think, the key questions that you were leading to at the end, the necessity and the proportionality of this in a democratic society. So thanks so much, Konstantinos. I think you've set up, a wonderful first half of the panel. And I'll now turn over to Susie, who's going to explore these legal and policy issues further. Susie, thank you whenever you're ready.
Thanks very much, Nora, and thanks again to Nora and to Lorna for this invitation and making this really fascinating discussion possible. And so what I'm going to talk about now is a slightly different perspective on what Konstantinos has already told us about nudging. And I'm going to look at the questions through the prism of the right to freedom of opinion and the related right to freedom of thought in international human rights law. So freedom of opinion in international human rights law is protected alongside freedom of expression. They're two sides of the same coin. And so essentially I have a right to hold an opinion and I have a right to express that opinion. And as Konstantinos has pointed out, my right to hold an opinion is also related to my ability to receive information in order to freely form an opinion. So looking at Article 19 of the ICCPR or Article 10 of the ECHR, before I start looking at some practical examples, I just want to unpick what the elements are of this right to freedom of opinion and the related right to freedom of thought. So both rights have a fairly broad scope. I have the right to hold an opinion about anything, whether it's about what colour socks I want to buy or who I want to vote for in an election. So it could be both profound political type opinions, or it could be flippant opinions of which kind of cat video I want to watch. The right to freedom of opinion has both an inner and an outer aspect. So the inner aspect is the ability for me in the privacy of my own mind to decide what I think about things. And the outer aspect is my ability to express my opinions and to tell you what I think about things. And the difference between the two in international human rights law is really crucial, because while the right to freedom of expression can be limited under international human rights law, the right to hold an opinion, as long as I'm keeping that opinion to myself, and the right to freedom of opinion in my inner world, is absolute. So what that means is that no interferences can be permitted in that inner world. There can never be a justification or a proportionality argument for limiting my freedom inside my own mind. Whereas when I start telling you about my opinions, then they may be limited for various reasons, whether it's to protect the rights of others, it might be national security, it might be preventing hate speech. And so I think that distinction between the inner and outer aspects is absolutely crucial. And today I'm going to focus on the inner aspect, the forum internum aspect of that right to hold opinions freely. And so what does it actually mean to have freedom in that inner space? Well, there's been very little jurisprudence on the subject, although there has been some on the related right to freedom of belief in the European Court of Human Rights, but very little on either the right to freedom of thought or the right to hold opinions freely. Professor Ibn Aswad earlier this year wrote a very interesting and insightful article that looked back at the foundations of the right to hold an opinion and the reasons why the drafters of international human rights law thought it was so important, and the aspects that they thought were so important. And it's very interesting to look at that history and then to reflect on what that means today and what we see in the digital sphere and particularly in the social media sphere. And so there were three planks historically of the right to freedom of thought and the right to freedom of opinion. The first is the right to keep your thoughts or opinions private. You don't have to disclose what you think to anybody. Obviously, on a daily basis, when we're interacting, we're all to a degree interpreting the person in front of us to try to understand what they might be thinking or how they might respond to what we're saying or how we're behaving. But essentially, we have a right to keep those thoughts and opinions private. But in today's world, and particularly in the surveillance capitalism model that Shoshana Zuboff so eloquently described, what we see is that big data and profiling techniques are precisely designed to try to understand what we're thinking and what our opinions might be on things without us directly expressing our thoughts or opinions. And in 2015, Facebook published research related to its likes and its ability to understand its users. And you will have seen a lot of headlines along the lines of Facebook knows you better than yourself, that based on a relatively small number of likes, the researchers found that they could fairly accurately predict the big 5 personality traits of a user. That's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And so this is obviously a key to understanding how individual people on Facebook might respond to different messages and different nudges. And essentially, it's a window into what a person is like on the inside. How accurate these kind of measures are is still open to debate. There's a fantastic website that allows you to apply magic sauce to your social media profiles. And on Twitter, the last time I looked, I was a 30-something man, and I'm not sure whether that's a good or a bad thing. But it shows that these predictions or these assessments are not necessarily accurate, and they may be gamed. But I think the fact that they are designed to try to understand what's going on inside us is something that we should be concerned about. And what I think is important to bear in mind is this question of where is the line around our forum internum? What we're talking about here is not just somebody reading what I've written on Facebook and making an assessment that I'm sad because I've said I'm sad. It's about somebody looking at what kind of cat videos I like, what kind of things I've shared, what kind of things I may have bought, and based on that, to make an assessment of what kind of a person I am. The second plank is the right not to have our thoughts or opinions manipulated. And again, going back to Facebook, not because I'm particularly picking on Facebook, but they have had some very useful research that illustrates the points. In 2014, Facebook published some research on emotional contagion by social media. And what that research showed was that just by manipulating a Facebook news feed, they could affect the way somebody feels. They could affect somebody's mood. So again, it's not really about trying to change whether or not somebody would vote for Brexit or not for Brexit, but it is about understanding how to change how somebody feels that day. And those kind of subtle changes in mood can have very profound impacts in the real world. It may be that simply by changing the order of a Facebook feed, you could make somebody feel rather apathetic or overconfident and decide then whether or not they're actually going to go out and cast a vote, for example, depending on how they're feeling that day. So I think it's very important to bear in mind that the shifts in opinion and the manipulations of opinion are not necessarily about radical changes, but this nudging technique can be used simply to affect how somebody behaves. And you can then choose how you want different groups of people to behave based on what you think their opinions might be. And so I think that is a big concern, both as individuals, but also for the wider impact of that. And the third part of the right is the right not to be penalised for your thoughts. And one of the important things that came out in the drafting of Article 19 of the ICCPR was that, I think it was the French delegation pointed out that it's not only about whether or not somebody can actually know what your opinions are or see into your mind, but it's also about inferences that might be made about what you think and what your opinion is, and that you shouldn't be penalized for inferences about what you think either. When you look at that from a surveillance context, for example, surveillance of social media or other activities that tries to identify trends that might reveal threats or risks, for example, raise questions about what measures might be taken and whether or not those measures are effectively a way of penalizing somebody for their thoughts. And similarly, on a less sort of criminal justice and security level, the choices that might be made simply about advertising to people or showing people opportunities could in some ways be penalizing a person, either for their thoughts or opinions or for assumptions that are being made about them. And so if you think about that, for example, there's a case again against Facebook in the US where they were being accused of digital redlining because Black people were apparently not being shown adverts for mortgages, for example, in Facebook in the US. And similarly, there have been complaints about people not being shown job adverts based on protected characteristics, or people not getting adverts for university courses that might well improve and increase their chances for the future, and whether or not those kind of choices and that kind of targeting may amount to a form of penalizing somebody for inferences about what is going on inside their head. I realise we don't have very much time today, and I'm really keen to hear from Lorna and Lorna's thoughts on regulation and the parameters that we can use to address the issues that Konstantinos and I have been talking about today. So I'm just going to stop there on freedom of opinion.
Thank you so much, Susie. So I found that absolutely fascinating that you do have a very clear black and white distinction between the ICCPR and other international instruments, and then the approach then under Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and then by extension the Human Rights Act of 1998, which does qualify the freedom to hold an opinion. And I think a lot of the points that you raise really do point towards a really hugely fundamental question about how that right should now be reconsidered in the 21st century, because as you mentioned, we now have data profiling techniques that are, for their very purpose, they're very raison d'etre, in line with Shoshana Zuboff's concept of surveillance capitalism, is to manipulate. So that those values of autonomy, dignity, and liberty are very much at the phrase now, because we inherently have the freedom to hold opinions being encroached upon, and by techniques and economic architectures and social media platforms that were just simply never conceived of when these instruments were being drafted in the 1940s and 50s. So I think, what you've touched upon is this hugely important debate. And I know that another author who's written on this, Yuval Noah Harari, in his book on, which, he's written several very good ones now dealing with the topic, but 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, he maintains that the argument that you're making is absolutely core to functioning democracy. So, if we've lost that particular ground in terms of people's right to hold an opinion, that in itself undermines all of the other rights that we exercise. So thank you so much for your contribution. I think it's just, followed on, really well from the case studies and the theoretical underpinnings that Konstantinos introduced. And I'm very much looking forward to Lorna's response now. Lorna, whenever you're ready, thank you.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you also to Susie and Konstantinos for two very interesting presentations. I've ended up with a whole list of questions and little doodles on a piece of paper in front of me. But there's two big picture questions that came to my mind, which I think are probably quite linked. Is that the first one is, when we are talking about nudging, are we always going to be talking about the same sort of thing? Or do we have to perhaps look a little bit more about how the language is being used here and what sort of use cases that we might try and say are examples of nudging? Because I think on one level, nudging could be absolutely anything, which then means, it's actually quite, I guess almost a libertarian perspective if you draw nudging very broadly. And two immediate thoughts came to mind. One is nudging different depending on whether it's done by a private company or whether it is done by the government. Presumably the government is acting in its version of the public interest. A private company need not be. And the second one, I suppose, is to what extent is it visible, or is it clear that we are making a choice? So I suppose in the cafeteria example, we are going there to choose our food. In the example perhaps of liking something, we're perhaps not so obviously making a choice. So do all the arguments, particularly those that Konstantinos raised, do they apply in the same way across everything? And if not, what are the criteria or the factors that we might take into account to distinguish, between them? And I suppose, just looking at my notes again, the other clear example is nudging to try and restore rationality, and nudging more broadly. The other sort of big picture point is, I think the context of social media is distinctive for a couple of reasons. So I think the discussion about nudging and autonomy is always individualistic. And the discussion about whether it's justified seems to be principally justified against the individual's own well-being or own objectives or whatever. It's a different discussion if we are talking about nudging for the benefit of others. And, that maybe that distinction is harder to make, is being nudged to do your pension just purely in your own interest, or in the interest of any family members you might have should you, die suddenly. But that's one question. And the context of social media is important because it's inherently about connecting people. So it's always going to be somewhere about how do we ensure the different interests of people in this space for bringing them together actually get taken into account. The other reason that I think social media is important is that it is entirely created. And so the software engineers, the designers, they have to make choices about how they're going to organize it. So does it make a distinction if they are nudging to try and create harmony and quality information rather than misinformation? And, is that a bad thing if they've got to make a choice, or should they not have a purpose and toss a coin? I think it's very difficult to move those issues out of it. And so I suppose the issues that Susie has raised about the consequences and the ability to manipulate people should actually also play a role in sort of determining what is acceptable design choice and what is unacceptable nudging or manipulative nudging. When we talk about this in the context of the internet, one of the current debates is about sort of frictionless communication and the consequences that has on what we watch, what we choose to forward. And I suppose, Twitter is an example of that. But if we're talking about autonomy and some sort of essential person, are there questions here both for Konstantinos and for Susie about whether those design choices are triggering us into communicating, and what sort of version of us is communicating? Is it the person who's sucked into the emotional headlines, or is it the rational and reflective being? And I suppose my question is, what's more authentic? How do we assess that from some sort of autonomy perspective, or holding our own opinions? Susie raised a lot of questions about the impact on the way the platforms operate and the surveillance capitalism model works. And I just wanted to draw one out, which is, if we're looking at profiling and the impact on people, the right to not to be manipulated, what is the consequence on the information that we receive, and how that affects our thoughts and our understanding of the world, as well as our understanding of what we want? If we're saying that well-being is about what we want, how do we know what we want? That's partly influenced by what's going on around. So again, what's the essential person? I have one final point to make, which moves from opinion and draws on one of Konstantinos' examples, which is about the barriers we can expect to overcome in making our choices. Now, Konstantinos gave the example of Twitter putting a page between viewers and some content, and all we have to do is click a button. Now, is that a lot to ask? And I also ask, how does this fit in with the phrase that's going around a lot at the moment, which is freedom of speech is not the same as freedom of reach. You don't have a right to maximum audience exposure. So on that note, I think I've come to the end of my initial thoughts, but I think there's a lot more to be said on what our two speakers have talked about.
Thank you so much, Lorna. I think that was an incredibly rich response, both addressing the points that Konstantinos raised and also, really drawing out on some of the legal themes and challenges that Susie's talk also noted. I quite liked the emphasis that you placed on the end there between the freedom of speech paradigm and then freedom of reach. I think that, again, it's all about the fact that even, the framing of that question, Lorna, and the framing of nudging itself, it's never neutral. Those values always have to be interrogated. And I think the points that you raised regarding the transparency of when such design and nudging techniques are used is a very significant one, in that it touches upon existing safeguards in relation to data protection law and the right to respect for private life, that there is a certain level of informed information. And of course, this feeds into the questions then, what's the legal basis that could justify the use of these techniques? And of course, you have questions surrounding consent, but then of course you have considerable literature that have critiqued, well, what does informed, meaningful consent actually constitute in this particular space? Because you are talking about what Susie referred to as the internal, the holding of opinions, and even a lack of awareness by individuals as to how they have indeed been influenced in a particular circumstance. So again, thanks so much to Lorna for raising those questions about having to make the use of design choices transparent. Who is entitled to use such techniques? What are the justifications? If I might add in a provocation of my own for the speakers that I really enjoy hearing their opinions on, would be when those lines are blurred. So for instance, what if you have a nudge towards something that is clearly in the public interest, such as governments asking certain social media platforms to include regular advertisements on getting the COVID vaccine? Where does that leave us, where we have a blurring of lines? We're falling into this realm of governments not placing limits or restrictions on social media, but actually wanting to use this design architecture infrastructure as part of a legitimate aim that all public authorities around the world have right now. So yes, Konstantinos, would you like to respond first, and then Susie, and then we have a question as well from the audience. So Konstantinos, whenever you're ready, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Susie, I'm really glad you raised the explained the distinction between freedom of speech and the right to hold an opinion, because it is crucial. And it does invite us to reconsider certain aspects of both rights, actually, I think, in the modern era. Now, in response to Lorna, because there's so many great points. First of all, can we say that there is such thing as nudging and just have a uniform approach to nudging in terms of policymaking? No, that's the answer. I mean, unless you want to be careful with your definitions and simply ignore everything that I was reading after the book, more or less. Because at some point, Sunstein said that even the weather is a nudge. And if we reach that point where, you know, everything is a nudge, then nothing is a nudge in philosophical terms. So it doesn't really matter. Yes, I think that is a very important point. For example, is nudging different? That's the second question, really. Is nudging different from everything else that we know if everything is a nudge? No. For example, if information is a nudge, then we have a very rich literature on information. We have a very rich literature on persuasion that is ignored when we discuss nudging. So if I may give an example real quick, think of how the government is trying to convince us. And that is relevant to Nora's point. The government always uses strategic persuasion, as a psychologist would put it, never deliberative persuasion. So the government is not open to debate. It's not going to ask you what your opinion is. It's going to tell you, go get the vaccine, for example. So if this is a nudge, then we must revisit all the literature and the empirical evidence about how persuasion works. And when we do that, we realize that there are limits to what the government can do. Not just the well-known ethical limits of, you know, should you say this or should you say that? Is it controversial and so forth? But also the obvious limits of persuasion. May I remind you that back in the 60s, there were posters that said that marijuana is the devil's harvest and it will send you to hell. That was manipulation in its purest form. And yet it was the framing that was the problem there, but it was an effort to persuade people. There was no coercion involved. So we need to be aware of all those issues. And one of the problems with nudging is exactly because everything is a nudge nowadays, you can't control the normative aspect at all, because every single time the goalposts are moved and you can't really follow. So we should be very careful, I think, especially now that we have nudge units and they just have this carte blanche to do whatever they want really in public policy. The second point about how nudges are always individualistic. That's a very good point. I think when it comes to organ donation, that's why I included that example, apart from the fact that it's impressive in terms of efficiency. I think that this is a clear case of how you can use choice architecture for the public good, the common good. And you could say, oh, let's all vaccinate, for example, because it will create herd immunity and everyone will be safe. So, of course you can do that. Is it different normatively? I doubt it, in my opinion. You know, it's the same kind of thing. And let's face it, people protest when they feel that they're not heard. So that is the important bit here. It's not going to make a difference if you actively try to promote the common good via nudging, if people still think that they're not respected as autonomous, equal members of the community. The third point was, is choice architecture a bad thing if it happens anyway? It depends. Is a tornado a bad thing if it brings your house down? Yes. Is it responsible for bringing your house down? No. The same applies to choice architecture. If the weather is a choice architect, if the climate is a choice architect, if things are there anyway, you know, designed in a specific way, but, you know, randomly, that doesn't mean that every time we do something about it, we're not committed to doing it right. So I think that this is actually an argument on the part of choice architects that doesn't convince me at all. The argument that, you know, we already have an architecture, it's there. Our options are already arranged in a specific way. So what's the difference? There's a difference. The difference is that you did something about it and it was wrong. That is a difference. Justice is about interpersonal relationships. If you're unjust to me, then it is your fault. So yes, and it is the duty of governments to do that. And that brings me to the fourth and perhaps final point that Lorna raised, which is basically that there is a difference, I think, in the sense that governments must be responsible choice architects, no matter what. It is in their job description. So there is a difference, but again, I'm reminded of Mill's concerns about social pressure. Back then, of course, she was concerned about, let's face it, the church. But now it can be something else. So it can be those large corporations. It can be surveillance capitalism. It can be Twitter. It can be Facebook. These could be the social powers that we should be afraid of nowadays. And we have two ways, I think. One is we give them that right. You do your choice architecture, but that means that you are responsible just like a government would be responsible. And it's not different at all. Or we say, you know something, you just can't do whatever you want. So we will heavily regulate the field. And then every single time you get it wrong, you will have to pay dearly, not just fines or something like that, but in fact, maybe losing some of your privileges as a choice architect. That could be a solution. Final point, freedom of speech, I agree, but that's why I try to say that it's not about so much about the right of free speech for the actual speaker as it is for the people who want to receive the information. That's why I brought up Trump as an example, not because I'm for or against his politics, but because his tweets were controversial. So that's where people start to think, oh, but no, I want to know what he has to say, or I don't want to know what he has to say. So I don't think that it's a big problem that people don't get the reach that they want. I don't think that Twitter owes me a certain reach, but I do think that it owes me the right to be able to assess information myself. And for that, I need access. So that is, I think, the important point there.
Thank you, Konstantinos. I think, you've made some very significant points there in relation to the arguments that Lorna put forward, in that, it's not just about the substantive use of nudging, it's also in the delivery and the capacity then for individuals to respond. And I also like the fact that you acknowledged Lorna's point regarding the different types and techniques of nudging. I mean, there is micro-targeting, which often gets talked about, but of course, that is just one of many varied techniques. There are obviously techniques that focus on groups and categories of people. and micro-targeting, another type of nudging technique, could also be used. You could be subject to a multitude of nudging techniques all at once. But of course, we go back to that key value of autonomy, whereby, as you said, where is the right to redress? Where is the right to respond? In that you have not been informed about A, the architecture being used, and those who are responsible for its design, the justification that they've put forward, whether a company or a government. Is it in the public interest? Is it the legitimate interest of a company? Is it both? And again, what limits, what redress is in place if this particular type of nudging is found to be dangerous or harmful? When you mentioned John Stuart Mill. So yes, I think, and the point as well you made about the dangers of monopolies, that consolidation of power, whether it's government or private or otherwise, that's the same risk, that risk of that power imbalance, and that design architecture, that paradigm, it's far from neutral. So yes, thank you so much. I'm in that terrible position, everyone, where as a chair, I'm enjoying this discussion far too much. And we have actually run over our official time. So I hope you will bear with us, because we really do want to hear Susie's response to Lorna, and then we will quickly wrap things up. So thanks so much, Susie.
Yeah, no problem. And I will be very brief, because I realise that people will have other things to go and do. So I won't probably be able to do justice to Lorna's points, but I hope that there'll be other opportunities to follow up on this discussion. I think very briefly, in terms of sort of nudging and your point about in the public interest and government adverts, for example, on vaccinations, I don't think those are the same things, really. I think one thing is about providing information, and the other is about moving people in a particular direction. But I think I agree that there are very blurred lines between sort of what is advertising, what is providing information, and what is nudging. And very briefly, I think what is really urgently needed is a very serious discussion about the entire advertising and marketing industry, and what that means in the digital world, and where the kind of lines of acceptability are. So I think there's a really big discussion that needs to be had on that. On Lorna's point about, what is the authentic self? One of the things that I realized following Twitter, and I've massively reduced my Twitter presence and actually gone into private mode recently to avoid the risks, because one of the ways that both Twitter and Facebook works is to sort of provoke people to say things publicly that they probably wouldn't actually ever say publicly if they weren't on social media. And you can see sort of entire careers collapsing because somebody posted something stupid on Twitter at 6 o'clock in the morning when they weren't really thinking about it. And your authentic self at 6 o'clock in the morning is not necessarily the same authentic self in your business meeting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We're not all just one thing. We have multiple selves. And one of the important things about freedom of thought and freedom of opinion is to have that inner space to decide what is socially acceptable for you to express in whatever situation you happen to be in at the time. And I think the other problem that we have with social media and the digital space is that this is never erased. It just goes on forever. Whereas, in previous lifetimes, what you happen to have said in a room 3 years ago is not going to follow you through your life to be your authentic self forevermore. And I think that's a big problem, particularly for sort of teenagers and young people who are growing up in this space, and expressing things that they may never be able to erase. And that again goes, I think, to the question of the freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. And one of the things that I think is really challenging is this idea about, we all have to be allowed to say what we want to say, and that any limitations on the reach of what we say is somehow stamping on our freedom of expression. But again, freedom of expression and freedom of information is also about the quality of the information, the quality of the expression. And it's also, again, going back to the listener, that, frankly, I don't really want to have the same volume of the bloke in the pub who I would normally be ignoring, and, the expert on whatever it is that I actually want to know about. And that was something that I found really striking in the Brexit debates, and sort of sitting on panels where you'd have 3 experts explaining that Brexit was not going to be good for fundamental rights. And then someone would say, oh, this isn't balanced. And it's like, well, if you want balance, go to the pub. It's like, if you want to ask experts, then this is what they're all saying, even though they haven't actually spoken to each other beforehand. So, you know, ignore it if you want. And I think that is a really big issue with this sort of, you know, the marketplace of ideas, is that there is no kind of weighting of what should realistically have reach and what shouldn't. And the fact that algorithms are deciding not really on quality, and that's one of the things, I think it was an internal Facebook report that raised the problem of driving polarization and inflamed speech rather than driving, you know, expertise or accurate information or whatever it is. And I realized that all of those, you know, those ideas are hotly contested as to who's an expert, whether you want to listen to an expert, you know, what's true, what's not true. And I think that is the real danger in this marketplace of ideas, is around, you know, freedom of speech and freedom of reach, because what, you know, what you're allowed to say to your neighbor is not necessarily what you're allowed to go and sit on national TV and say. And yet on the internet and in the digital space, those lines are very, very much blurred.
Thank you very much, Susie. I completely agree in terms of the fact that the end normative goal for those particular examples that you gave is the free flow of information. There isn't a prioritization of accurate information, or even that threshold of reliable information that can be underpinned by experts, by peer review, by verification even. It's just the encouragement of the free flow of information, and the nudging technique is being employed basically towards polemical views, because that feeds into this economic online advertising architecture of surveillance capitalism, and then the attention economy. It's the engagement, it's that reach, and how to keep expanding that reach and maintaining it. So these are very, very significant conflicts of values. And right now, I think from your talks and also from Lorna's contribution and interventions, is that we are really grappling with this balance right now. If indeed, you know, we have that balance that I think Konstantinos mentioned earlier on. John Stuart Mill, he raised these concerns centuries ago, but if he could only see the algorithms and the big data applications that is available today, I think he would be very concerned, and rightly so. But I am somewhat reassured that there are experts here today that are looking into these particular fundamental questions that are so important to how our democracy functions. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have chaired this panel. Thanks so much to you both for a really insightful and very provocative and rich discussion. And I hope our attendees will forgive me when I thank Lorna, our discussant, and Susie and Konstantinos for a really fascinating discussion that really did warrant going, you know, there's 10 minutes extra over time. And hopefully, Susie, we can all get together in a pub sometime in the future and discuss this all more. I hope 2021 has that in store for us. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Also, this event will be recorded and we will have this made available on our website shortly. But for now, please join me in thanking our speakers. Thanks so much to Lorna. And I hope you all have a really wonderful rest of day. And I think I'll take the opportunity to also wish you a lovely Christmas and a good break. So thank you very much, and bye-bye.